Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for all attending from so many parts of the world. It's really fantastic to see that. So what we're going to do this evening is have a very informative and interesting lecture on a subject of Carl Linnaeus. And it was the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau who sent him a message saying, "Tell him I know no greater man on earth." And Johann Wolfgang von Goethe said, "With the exception of Shakespeare and Spinoza, I know no one among the no longer living who has influenced me more strongly." And the Swedish author and playwright August Strindberg wrote, "Linnaeus was really a poet who happened to become a naturalist." So this is a very famous man, arguably the most famous Swede of the 18th century, and still one that most people would associate with Sweden in its high glory days in the 16th, 17th, and particularly the 17th and 18th centuries. He was born in 1707 in the sort of depths of the Great Northern War, the first part of that, and he shared his name Carl with Carl XII, who was prosecuting that war with variable degrees of success until his death in 1718. Carl Linnaeus himself lived for 71 years and achieved a very great deal during that time, including becoming ennobled in 1761 by Adolf Frederick and becoming Carl von Linné, or Carolus Linné, for the latter part of his life. What we're going to hear about, though, is really the Linnean Society and some aspects of Linnaeus's work that perhaps has had less exposure than some of the very important taxonomical works that he did and are widely known today and still very influential. So we're very, very pleased as a society to welcome two people who are very central to the Linnean Society, which is located in Burlington House, as you'll see in a minute. And the two people who are going to help us with the lecture this evening are librarian Will Beharrell, who is on Zoom with us this evening, and somebody who's going to give us a lecture and show us a sort of montage of what we could have had were we able to visit the Linnean Society in Burlington House. And we're very pleased to welcome Isabelle Charmantier, who is the head of collections there. And she'll now take the talk away, as it were, and then there'll be an opportunity at the end of, first of all, a video, and second, a lecture, for us to put questions to Isabelle and Will to answer, to satisfy our curiosity that no doubt will have been raised substantially by what we're about to hear. So thank you very much, Will, and particularly Isabelle, for coming and sharing your knowledge with us this evening.
Thank you, David. So what usually happens in the tour is that once we get into the collection store, I present quite a lot about the collections of Linnaeus, which, as I mentioned in the film, includes his books. So not only the books that he published, but also the books from his library, his manuscripts, and that includes his correspondence, his letters, and then the biological specimens, so the pressed plants, pressed fish, insects, and shells. But today, I think I'm going to concentrate on, as David said, on the subject matter that is a direct result of the Black Lives Matter events over the summer, and that really have made us think about our collections and our links to Linnaeus. So while the Linnean Society as a whole has, in the last 2 years, become wanting to become more diverse and equal through events and displays in the collections related, for example, to our first female fellows on the left, or diversity in natural history, the one topic that has emerged that we really needed to look at was the thorny issue of Linnaeus and race. Linnaeus's work on the classification of man forms one of the 18th century roots of modern scientific racism. And most people, when they write about this issue of racism in particular, have mostly looked at his printed work and mostly at his 10th edition of Systema Naturae in 1758. But really what I wanted to do in a blog that I wrote and that is online, and this talk is directly inspired from there, is to just think about what prompted Linnaeus to develop this classification of man, and in order to trace the development of an idea which became fundamental in the history of anthropology and has had devastating and far-reaching consequences for humanity, we also need to include his manuscript and letters. So look at his output more broadly than just one book. And I should say that this research is indebted to the Swedish historian Gunnar Broberg, and in particular to the work that Dr. Staffan Müller-Wille, who is now at the University of Cambridge, has been undertaking. So just to go back slightly to Enlightenment thinkers, they inherited a very hierarchical view of the natural world from the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and we have a few examples here on the screen. And the idea of a great chain of beings arranged in a series of gradients or steps, with God at the very top and man underneath, and down through animals and vegetables to inorganic minerals at the bottom. We see here in the 16th century on the left, God at the top, and there are angels in between God and man. And then the two examples on the right are from the 18th century. Linnaeus first published his major, or I should say Linnaeus' taxonomic work partly upset this linear hierarchy of more or less perfect natural beings. He first published his major work of classification, Systema Naturae, in 1735, when he was quite young, he was 28. And Systema Naturae provided a classification of the then three kingdoms of nature. And it did this in a very, very original way. Systema Naturae, the first edition, is a very big book in its size. It's a folio book, but it's a very slim one in that it has only got 11 pages. And the reason for that is that Linnaeus classified all three kingdoms of nature through three big tables. So here we have the vegetable kingdom and the mineral kingdom. And we are more interested today in the animal kingdom, which is here. As you can see, the animal kingdom contains 6 classes. So we have from the left, and these are the columns. I hope you can see my pointer. We have the quadrupeds, then the birds, amphibians, fish, insects, and worms. And under worms are mostly invertebrates. Quadrupeds, Linnaeus would rename several years down the line. He'll rename it mammals. And this is the class we're interested in, and we're particularly interested in the first order within that class, that first box. I'm trying to get my cursor up. That first box here, which I'm going to blow up, that of Anthropomorpha, which again Linnaeus will rename in a later edition as primates. So mammals and primates are words, obviously, that we still use today. Excuse me. So within this order of Anthropomorpha, we have 3 genera, and this is where Linnaeus departs from previous naturalists in that he places man firmly in the kingdom of animals, in the class of quadrupeds and in the order of Anthropomorpha that he shares with Simia, the apes, and Bradypus, the sloth, for some reason. The choice to include humans within animals in quadrupeds was not welcomed by everyone in his contemporaries. And Linnaeus had to defend this choice throughout his career. So for example, in a letter to the St. Petersburg naturalist Johann Gmelin, some 12 years after the first publication of Systema Naturae, so this is 1747, Linnaeus reiterated that he was quite irritated by he mentioned the persistent irritation expressed by scholars, but yet he challenged Gmelin and the rest of the world to name a generic difference between man and ape based on the principles of natural history. So having placed humans within the animal kingdom, Linnaeus distinguished them from other animals in the same order of Anthropomorpha by the ability to know thyself. So this is the nocete ipsum that follows homo here. And this would lead Linnaeus to attribute the specific epithet sapiens to the genus homo when he began to use his binomial nomenclature in the 1750s. And then he proceeded to classify humans further, as he did with other organisms. And it's briefly sketched here on the right, where we have the 4 varieties of the human species. So Systema Naturae was edited 12 times in Linnaeus's life. As each edition was amended, corrected, and augmented, Systema Naturae grew in scope and content. You have here on the right the 10th edition, 1758 Systema Naturae, which I'll come back to later as it's such a fundamental book. And you can see that the 3 tables of the first edition have become 3 volumes. I've included the picture of the collection store to show you the extent of the editions of Systema Naturae on our shelves. And so this is quite an old one. It's 2006, but it's the only one to have the angle that I needed. And the editions of Systema Naturae, so Linnaeus's own works, which are annotated by him, and I should say are available to browse on our website. We have them all digitized. So they make up the first 2 shelves here on this bay on the left. So quite extensive. And for the first 9 editions, so that's from 1735 to 1756, Linnaeus's classification of man remained stable, with this human species divided into 4 types, or varieties, as he called them in Latin. I have the translation on the right here, and they're here. So this is the 2nd edition of Systema Naturae, 1740, and you can see it's been annotated by Linnaeus. And we have the European white, American reddish, Asian tawny, and African black. The word that Linnaeus uses to denote these varieties is varieties of man, and we can see here homo variat right here. As far as we know, Linnaeus never used the word race in reference to humans or any other organisms, and the term variety is significant because while subspecies would distinguish stable types, varieties do not. So varieties are not stable, and this is quite important. Linnaeus's division into 4 varieties of man corresponded to the then known 4 continents of the world, so Europe, America, Asia, and Africa. And this division, according to the 4 corners of the world, is one that came back in a variety of ways in Linnaeus's writing on plants, for example, and commodities. So we have coffee, tea, beer, and chocolate, which are also representing the 4 continents, for instance. In this case, for the case of the human species, there's an emphasis on geography as well. And Linnaeus shared contemporary views that skin color, which is the chief criterion of distinction employed in the Systema Naturae, was largely a product of climate, and therefore was as variable as other accidentally bodily characteristics of humans, like, for example, height or weight. So this is for the first nine editions. As I said, this classification of man remains quite stable. But then we come to the 10th edition of Systema Naturae, and it becomes very different, as I'll show you in a minute, because Linnaeus added various other criteria to these criteria of geography and skin color. And I think this is where the study of his manuscript is important, to understand how and why he took this decision to deepen the classification of humans in ways which have such unfortunate long-lasting consequences. So we have several of these manuscripts in our collections, and I have to say I've only started looking at this along with Staffan Müller-Wille, and this is something that needs a little bit more research. But for instance, we have a manuscript draft entitled Anthropomorpha, which probably dates from the mid to late 1750s. So what you have on the screen here is the whole page on the left and a blow up on the right. And you can see that Linnaeus is already starting to attribute some of his binomial names, and he's changed the name Homo diurnus, so the man that lives in the day, to the epithet sapiens. So we're probably quite close to the publication of it's probably, mid 1750s. And these are possibly lecture notes, and they go beyond simply stating the locality and skin colors of humans. The amendments and crossing outs indicate that this was very much a work in progress. The manuscript also includes extracts of other works that Linnaeus was reading on the subject, and which may have influenced some of his classifications. So we encounter Pliny, older works like Pliny, but also Pierre-Louis Maupertuis, the Frenchman. We also notice that Linnaeus is kind of playing around with the order in which these varieties occur. And I'll show you another manuscript, which is quite a touching one. It's lecture notes from his son when Carl Linnaeus the Younger was probably about 10 years old and was made to sit in his father's lectures. So we have the father's lectures note to give the lectures, and we have the son's note copying what his father is teaching. And it's nice to contrast, because Linnaeus the Younger's handwriting is so much clearer than Linnaeus the father. And you can see here quite clearly that the order has gone from European at the top to having Asiaticus at the top. So the result of this whole research that Linnaeus is quite clearly undertaking and teaching in the 1750s was the 1758 10th edition of Systema Naturae. And this really is the text that when people write about racism, they come back to as the origin of scientific racism. This is also the work that scholars and the public turn to, and one of the reasons is that the 10th edition of Systema Naturae is considered by biologists as the starting point of binomial nomenclature. So it's a very important work for scientists as well. So it's worth spending the last bit of this talk a little bit of time looking at what the end result, in effect, of Linnaeus's classification of man looks like in Systema Naturae, because there are still 2 more editions to come, but it doesn't actually change that much. Excuse me. So whereas the previous editions classified man within 4 lines, as we've seen, the 10th edition devotes 5 pages to the genus Homo. And there are extensive footnotes that cover half the pages as well. So I'm only showing you the first 3 because they cover what I want to talk about. First of all, you see that we have mammals and primates rather than quadrupeds and anthropomorpha. The genus Homo now has its specific epithet sapiens, and the varieties are listed here in the margins in italics. And you will see that we've gone from 4 varieties to 6, and I will deal with the first and the 6th one quite quickly. The first variety is called Ferus, meaning wild. So these are wild children and youngsters. The last one is called Monstrosus. And in Monstrosus, we find groups which were allegedly shaped by their environment. So I hope you can see, we have, for example, Alpini, who are living high in the mountains, for instance, and Linnaeus qualifies them as being small, agile, and shy. And then further down, we have also in the monstrous variety, Linnaeus has placed what he calls the Hottentots, people from southern Africa, and he's called them with the name Monarchides, because according to him, they were less fertile because of the fact that they had only 1 testicle. And then just a final example, we also have here Junkea puella abdomine attenuato in Europe. And these are European girls with artificially constricted waists, so girls wearing corsets. So that's the monster variety. We now turn to our 4 varieties. And once again, you can see that the order of them has changed. We now start with the Americanus. And possibly Linnaeus chose to place him first. He was possibly influenced by the ideas of noble savage. One variety, however, that is consistently at the bottom of the list, well, above the monstrous one, are the Africanus. And it's also the longest, the most detailed and physical, and it's also the most negative, as you'll see. So to that, Linnaeus has added quite a lot of other criteria. And rather than explain this on the page, I've made a table to make it slightly more readable. And there are 5 criteria now that he describes for each of these varieties. The first one is the skin color and the medical temperament corresponding to the 4 medieval humours and body posture. And the 4 medieval humours were thought to be so sanguine, choleric, melancholic, and phlegmatic. Number 2, second criteria are physical traits relating to hair color and form, eye color, and distinctive facial traits. And I'll just leave you a minute to read. Number 3 are behavior. Number 4, manner of clothing. And number 5, form of government. And this is pretty much the way that the classification of man will stay in the next 2 editions, the last 2 editions of Systema Naturae. Linnaeus continuously revised his work, and some of this is revised, but they're really minor revisions. So to conclude, the idea of a graded scale of nature really survived in Linnaeus's linear arrangement of human varieties. And I think his rearrangement of the order in which these varieties occur is significant. And certainly it was deemed to be so by his contemporaries, and they viewed his classification of man in a hierarchical manner. And it carried on being used in such a way throughout the following decades. And thus, Linnaeus' hierarchy, with Black people at the very bottom, associated with negative moral and physical attributes, has really stuck to this day. Of course, Linnaeus was not the only naturalist writing about the human species in the 18th century. In fact, he wrote comparatively less on the subject than his contemporaries, such as, for example, the Comte de Buffon in France, or Maupertuis, who I've mentioned, or the German physician Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, all of whom would influence later writers such as Immanuel Kant or Charles Darwin. What remained influential was Linnaeus's classification. Authors after Linnaeus presented his classification of humans as a series of trinomials instead of binomials, so 3 scientific names together, entrenching the view that Linnaeus's varieties were really subspecies and not varieties, so stable entities. This was the case with the English translation of Linnaeus in 1792, which probably gave rise to the idea that Linnaeus believed that human races actually constituted subspecies. And it provides a really good example of how ambivalent and very tentative ideas in science can become entrenched with time due to development in wider culture. And I started this talk, and this is the end of my talk, but I realize I have failed to thank my hosts this evening. So I'm very grateful to David and Alexander for giving us this opportunity to present some of my work and some of the Linnean Society collections. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Isabelle. That was tour de force, and certainly is a great deal of material for thought and discussion, especially, of course, the actual talk and the PowerPoint that you gave. And it's a very challenging topic, but it's one that is better to talk about than not talk about. I'm sure we'd all agree with that. I know there will be questions, and there'll be opportunity to ask many questions. I'd quite like to start the questioning by us just asking Eric Orlowski, who's doing social and cultural anthropology at UCL right now as a PhD. Maybe he can kick off with a few thoughts around what this actually means and how we should interpret it perhaps in 2021, thinking back to when Linnaeus was actually doing these things.
Hi, yeah, thank you, David. I think as you pointed out, is obviously a question that has come very much to the fore over the past year, and even a bit before that. Being at the institution UCL, we ourselves are reckoning with the fallout of Galton and effectively being the institution that invented eugenics. So it is it is overall a topic that is very, very present. And I think most academic circles that touch upon the human in one way or the other. I do have a couple of questions as David managed to divine. And first of all, I think it's interesting because you did mention how he, for example, influenced Immanuel Kant, who I think is technically a bit referred to as an anthropologist, but I don't think any anthropologist wants to claim his actual anthropological work at this rate, because he famously never left Königsberg. He was writing about the nature of humans without really having met nobody else except his neighbors. So the question is, like, when it then comes to Linnaeus, what was his exposure to, like, the quote unquote other races or other variety of peoples? Like, did he? I'm assuming from his travels that he never went to Africa and Asia, because not as far as I'm aware. But is there any evidence of exposure through, say, trade or other travelers or something like that? And on that as well, I think that's question number one. And on that as well is also, you used the word variety, because that's what he was using in his own writings. When did the word race enter into the actual discourse? And kind of what was the nature of introducing a different sort of word to describe to describe the whole project or endeavor, or scientific racism's core underpinning point? And as a final, and I suppose the harsher or more difficult question perhaps, is with the sort of shift from the kind of Enlightenment philosophy that happened, or the sort of criticism that hits a lot of the Enlightenment philosophy post 1945 and the Nazi atrocities, was there a rethinking of Linnaeus's work with the emergence of sort of modernism and later on post-modernity as we're seeing now? Or is this a kind of more recent project that has come about to rethink his work with our own lens, so to speak? I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you. I should have warned you that this is my first foray into the kind of classification of man topic. So I'm probably very much the wrong person to answer some of your questions, in particular as to the history of the idea of racism, because that's really not my topic at all. So unfortunately, the last two questions that you asked, when was the term race introduced? I believe it's sometime in the 19th century, but I wouldn't be able to tell you exactly when. And the rethinking of Linnaeus's work, I think it is pretty recent. There was, for the bicentenary of the Linnean Society, there was a brief article in one of the literature that was produced that dealt with, was Linnaeus a racist? So it is something, and that was 2007, I should say. So it is relatively recent, I think, but other than that, I couldn't confirm this. I'm a little bit more comfortable answering your first question as to Linnaeus's exposure to other people. So Linnaeus did travel, but to Europe. But I mean, he was in Leiden, he was in Holland, where there's a lot of commerce going on. So I don't know. This is actually something that I want to find out from his letters and more of his diary, because I think this is quite important. The one anecdote that I have is quite interesting. There was an albino black girl who was on show in London in I think it's about the 1750s, called Amelia Newsham, and Linnaeus was desperate for his correspondents in London to go and examine her. It makes quite for uncomfortable reading, actually, the whole discourse. But he is incredibly fascinated by this girl. It's a girl at this time, and he wants to know more, and he wants to do that in the context of his classification of man. So I don't think he had encountered. I don't think his exposure to anything else than white Europeans was extensive. But it's something I'd quite like to find out, because having been in Holland, I would have thought, and briefly in London and Oxford, these places that there were Black people around at the time. So I would have thought he would have encountered people with a different skin color, but I need to investigate a little bit more.
So can I make a comment?
Yeah.
I don't, Neil Kent. First of all, the word race in the, not in the genetic or DNA sense, obviously, but it really came into vogue in Western Europe in the early 1500s. And people often, too, when they used race, they also used it in terms of extended families or clans. But Linnaeus, first of all, in another thing one should be aware of, that Sweden was the last Northern European country to abolish African chattel slavery, which was about 1849, much later than the Brits. And there were still Black slaves in St. Bartholomeus, which was extremely poor at that time. But now, of course, is an extremely rich part of France, Outremer. And the other thing, Linnaeus, of course, would have been aware in Uppsala of people who'd been to China and the East Asiatic Company, which was very important in Sweden at the time. In fact, there was a famous cow which went, I think, 6 times to China on a ship from Gothenburg to Canton to provide milk, and each time returned to Sweden. So if that cow could have talked, I think he would have had a lot of interesting things to say. But also Linnaeus had a lot to do with Sami peoples, and he saw them as very distinct from the people, the rest of the people in Sweden. And he also projected onto them this idea that you were talking about earlier of the red American, of being somehow purer and more and wilder, and therefore to be more admired. And there's a famous painting of him dressed up as if he were a Sami.
Yes, absolutely. And you're right to mention the East India Company, because of course Linnaeus had his own students who traveled the world. He called them his disciples, and he sent them, as you say, and they went, all over Latin America, all the way to China. Per Osbeck went all the way to China, most of them through the Cape of Good Hope, if they were going east. So absolutely. And on the Sami, you're right. So we've got the Lapland Diary at the Linnean Society, and it's a fascinating read because it has this whole ethnographic aspect to it. And I think he does compare the Sami to, I think I quote something like the shepherds of old, living a life which is much closer to nature and without all our trappings of modern society. Yeah.
We might also mention,
sorry, Neil. No, carry on, Neil.
No, just to say, we had a very interesting evening at the Lord Mayor's a few years ago, talking about Wadström and Sweden's role in the abolition of the slave trade.
Oh, I didn't know that at all, actually.
From the Anglo-Swedish Society, in fact.
Oh, probably, yes, before I joined, unfortunately. But nowadays, because we're recording the lectures, these will be a wonderful, including Isabelle's lecture, there'll be a wonderful opportunity for people to catch up on such a wide variety of different things. Any other questions? I've got a question, but I want to let other people have a chance. Sadly, I'm not able to see absolutely everybody in this screen view. I definitely need to go on the 8th of February and learn more about how to reorientate myself with Zoom. If anybody wants to pipe up with a question, I mean, Eric, you may have another one, but I want to get my one in. Well, while people are waiting, I will ask my one. The thing, it's more a comment than a question, but it to me is quite remarkable that you said, Isabelle, that the very first edition of Systema Naturae in 1735 had made the decision to put humans with apes, and I think it was sloths for some reason. But that was 124 years before Darwin dared to make the same sort of observation, or at least suggest there was a link. Now, it was pretty controversial in Darwin's time, as everybody knows. It took him a very long time to pluck up the courage and the fear of being scooped before he actually did that. But I mean, going back to the reaction to Linnaeus, that surely was deeply unpopular with what was a religious country, a Lutheran country. I mean, how was it received at the time?
Yes, no, it wasn't received very well. Hang on. I've got a quote from one of his correspondents at the time. Let me get my text again. But certainly it wasn't received, and as I've said, it wasn't received well. And as I've said, it continued not to be very well received by his contemporaries. I don't know if I've kept that quote. No, I haven't. Sorry. But yes, no, he had to battle through that. I mean, it's not, as you know, everything in science is quite incremental. So you have, for example, in the 16th century, a French naturalist, Pierre Belon, who puts two engravings, comparative anatomy of a bird and a man. So it's not quite the same, but it's that kind of, comparing characters, defining characters for classification. And for Linnaeus, as he says, there, apart from our introspection and the ability to know ourselves, he cannot see any generic difference between ape and man. So for him, it makes no sense to have us outside of the animal kingdom.
But that would imply he wasn't looking at this through a religious lens at all. There was no preconception. No.
There is no sense of sorry, I'm going about it the wrong way. Linnaeus is deeply religious. So it has no impact on his belief in God.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you. Paul Engerham has a question. Paul, please ask.
Thank you very much indeed. Isabelle, a riveting talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I noticed in the first edition that Homo, without the sapiens at that stage, is defined as with the Latin quip nosce te ipsum, which I know as the motto of a number of families and other organizations. Do you or anybody else know from what perhaps classical source that's originally is derived? Over.
That is a very good question, and I don't know. And I don't know if Will, do you?
The Delphic maxim, nosce te ipsum, it's one of the, it's know thyself. It's written over the door at the Temple of Delphi. It's, there's hundreds of them, but that's one of the most famous. So it was a classical commonplace for centuries, nosce te ipsum.
Thank you very much. I assumed it was, but had wanted that confirmed. That's really useful. Thank you very much.
And a comment that Lewis Hill has made, I'm sure he won't mind me sharing it, is that to what extent do the attitudes that we might recoil at slightly from our 2021 perspective simply reflect the paradigm of the zeitgeist that Linnaeus was living through. Essentially, these were normal thoughts for his times, even though we would not in any way fit them now.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Certainly. I think, yes, I can only agree with that statement. I mean, to me, when we talk about racism and Linnaeus, it is somewhat problematic because while I would say while he had beliefs that would have been recognized by most of his contemporaries, you do also have people who are anti-slavery in the 18th century. So there are both sides, but I would say they do reflect most of his contemporaries. I mean, the thing is, he derives it from contemporary writings. So yes, I would say that's right.
Thank you. Any other questions? Alexander's probably in the best position to see literal or metaphoric raising of hands. If
I can't see any raised hands just
okay.
at the moment, but I see a lot of intent concentrated.
Good. Well, maybe we'll. What do you think, Alexander? Draw the affair to a close. Oh no,
Torquil is raising his hand.
Yep, fantastic.
My knowledge of Linnaeus was to do with the classification of plants. Did he, in fact, change the way in which they were classified at all from previous times?
So plants.
Yes, flowers.
Oh, that's a whole other lecture.
Oh, right.
Right
Okay.
there. Yes, definitely. So Linnaeus is interesting because I think his passion for classifying extended to everything, and certainly for plants, he had various systems of classification. His aim was to be able to classify the plants according to a natural order of nature, which would reflect the affinities that plants have together. But while he was trying to attain that aim that was actually unattainable, he developed this system of classification called the sexual system of classification, which was really popular at the time and after his death because it's so simple. It's a system that is based on the sexual characters of a plant, of its flower. So namely the male characters, the stamens, and the female characters, the pistils. And all you have to do is count the stamens and you have the class to which the plant belongs. And then you count the pistils and you have the order to which the plant belongs. And so it's extremely artificial. It has no basis in nature, but it was very, very practical and an easy system, and hence its popularity. Linnaeus knew that it was far too artificial, but for him he believed his aim was to be able to classify the whole of the natural world, and in particular plants, because at heart he was a botanist. And he believed that in his lifetime, at least at the beginning, his aim was to classify the whole of the world's plants, and that he would use this very simple system until he had a knowledge of all the world's plants, and then he would come up with a much better system that would mirror the way nature works. Obviously, that didn't happen because it's impossible to know all the world's plants, but certainly his system of classification was very popular. It wasn't popular in France, where the naturalist kind of really didn't like it. It became very popular in England, even before the acquisition of the Linnean collections by James Edward Smith. So for example, you've got Charles Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, wrote a poem called The Love of the Plants, which is entirely based on the sexual system of classification of Linnaeus. Sorry, I could go on, but I won't. I'll spare you.
I think, Isabelle, we shall have to get you back on another occasion to go into the plant world in more details. But I think that's a fantastic hour and a bit, and thank you so much to you and Will for coming and giving us the benefit of your wisdom in this area, and including the sort of new thoughts around Linnaeus in terms of other aspects of his work that perhaps didn't get the prominence that it currently does have. So very, very much thanks to you both. I just emphasize that when things return to normal, the place itself in Burlington House, the Linnean Society, is very much worth a visit. You have to, of course, you can't just walk in. One has to have an opportunity to go on one of the tours, but I found that a very well spent 90 minutes when I went myself a little while ago. So thank you. I'll now stop and hand back to Alexander to finish the evening, if that's okay.
It's very lovely, and thank you. I'll join in with David and say thank you very much, Isabelle, and also Will for being there in the background to support. And thank you, David, for hosting and making this evening happen. David and Eric Orlovsky will be holding a talk next month. It's on the 24th, yes?
24th, yes.
Yeah, and just a word about that, please.
Yes, I've got a medal here. You won't really be able to see it terribly well. It's not my medal. I mean, it is my medal. I bought it, but I didn't get it. And this is a medal that commemorated what are called the Swedish pioneers. It was actually minted in 1948 to commemorate 100 years of what are called the Swedish pioneers. And when you actually look at the medal, I'll just do it very quickly, you can see that it's geese going from Sweden to America, which I can assure you doesn't happen. But it represents a flight of people from Sweden to America. Now, why did they go? I looked at that medal and I thought, well, what's that about? And I poked around and found out quite a lot about the history of the Swedish emigration. But it's what it led to, which is even more interesting for those people left behind. So I'll do the emigration bit, and Eric's going to take us through what it actually meant for Sweden, because it was quite an extraordinary beginning of what has then become a defining feature of the country Sweden we know today. So I would, there'll be plenty of advertising about that, and everybody who's here be really welcome to come and to listen to something a little bit different. Sounds a bit like Monty Python now for something completely different, but the point is, it's another example of the wonderful talk range that we get now with the society and with our friends in the sister societies. So thank you very much indeed.
We look forward to that, and we have some other ideas lined up. It's looking a bit bleak for the 30th of April. I suspect we won't be able to meet in person, but perhaps we'll schedule something to happen on the day so we don't let it pass unnoticed. And I'm going to embarrass Sarah Death for as our newest member. We texted a little earlier, and so welcome as our newest member, and she was kind enough to say she's enjoyed joining us, and it was coming along to things, and it was time to join. So encourage all your friends, please. Now's a good time to join. And finally, we're very happy to have the connection with the Linnean Society. We've had this, the Anglo-Swedish Society and the Linnean Society have had regular contact over the last 10 decades. So it's nice for that to continue. And thank you everyone for coming. It's been wonderful, and we've all learned a lot this evening. Thank you.
And thank you, Alexander.
And thank you from us.
Thank you.